Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. This is Denis McClean, founder of the Geneva Literary Aid Society, also known as GLAS, welcoming you to this first ever online event. GLAS was founded about 15 years ago, and we initially started because we wanted to mark the connection between James Joyce and Geneva, and also to celebrate the centenary of Ulysses. And we hosted David Norris's splendid one-man show on James Joyce. We meant it to be a one-off event, but in fact we kept going, and here we are still in business 15 years later. But of course, because of current circumstances, we are unable to continue with our live events. So we thought we'd just keep in touch with our audience by organizing this series of Meet the Author events. And we're starting tonight with poet Padraig Rooney, best known for his poetry. He's won the Patrick Kavanagh Award, and his short stories have featured in several collections of short stories. His poetry has also appeared in the Penguin Book of Poetry for the 20th century. I've actually known Padraig quite a long time. He's been one of our guests at GLAS, where he did a wonderful poetry reading several years ago. And we thought that for this first event, it would be very appropriate to have him here, because he's written this fantastic book called The Gilded Chalet, which is a literary tour of Switzerland, and contains 15 brilliant chapters, each standalone, and brings us right from Julius Caesar up to James Joyce's arrival in Switzerland. And many of you will know, of course, that GLAS is a not-for-profit organization. It's all volunteers working for GLAS when we put on our events. And one of our favorite charities is the Edith Wilkins Foundation for Street Children. We've donated over 80,000 euros to that charity over the last few years. And I was talking to them on Saturday morning. At the moment, there are 60 children in residence in the centre there in Darjeeling. They're under lockdown. And I'm afraid to say that they are struggling to keep the whole place going. They've had to introduce a food rationing system because it's very hard to get fresh vegetables and other things like that. So if you go to the GLAS website and you would like to make a small donation to help them out during this difficult period, please feel free to do so. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn to Padraig and ask him an obvious kind of question. Why, Padraig, did you decide to write this book in the first place? What was the inspiration for it?
Good evening, Denis. Thanks for that introduction. Well, like all things, it had several starting points. I suppose it goes right back to my first introduction to Switzerland in 1973, when I escaped the rigors of Ireland, and I remember hitching down the Rhine with my sister, and my sister already had a job in Kleinscheidegg in the Bernese Oberland, and I didn't have a job, and I was hitching on the Susten Pass, and a car picked me up, and I was a 17-year-old straight out of school, and I got a job in Basel in a kind of market garden, just where the Byron Museum is now, out at Riehen, for a month. And it was a hot summer. I remember I was kind of watering tomatoes and picking chrysanthemums, and generally getting up really early and getting the first tan of my life, probably. And then I worked.
You're still in Basel to this day.
And I'm still in Basel to this day. Well, there was a long hiatus, if like a hegira, and I came back after that summer to work at the international school here. I think it was 2002. Yeah. And I'd been writing in the meantime, and I think it was a case of writing about Patricia Highsmith, who spent some time down in Ticino, and then realizing that her archive is in Bern, in the literary archives in Bern, and going and fossicking around that for a while, and writing up that chapter or something close to that chapter. And then I realized, when I was down at the Paper Museum here in Basel, it's in the St. Alban part of town, it's a really old printing works, that I could do something with this, and way leads on to way, as they say.
And you're not the first Irishman to have passed through Basel, because I read in an early chapter in the book that the poet who accompanied Hugh O'Neill and Hugh O'Donnell on their flight from Donegal to Rome, as they passed through Switzerland, I think their first point of entry was Basel. And the poet Tig, who kept a journal of that trip, makes a mention of it in his journal.
Yeah, he wrote the journal in Irish, and he was the scribe accompanying these Irish lords who were, I think they originally intended heading for Spain, but they got lost en route, and they were heading down the Rhine, and with the intention of going to Rome at that point, and they must have made a wrong turning. And Basel, of course, was the gateway to Switzerland, and Tig wrote in Irish, so effectively it's the first travel journal in the Irish language, and he describes entering Basel from the west and then crossing along the river and heading towards the St. Alban Gate. And he had the mistaken idea, I think it was mistaken, I'm not quite sure, that Liestal was more a Catholic town than Basel was, and I think they were a little bit frightened of spending a night in Basel, because as exiled Catholics or fleeing Catholics, they felt they might get a better welcome
Do you think
in Liestal.
Do you think that his description of the Swiss character still passes muster today?
It does. I read a little bit of that. He has a wonderful perception of Swiss democracy. Of course, coming from a kind of the outpost of the British Empire, he would appreciate Swiss democracy, but also the mix of religions in the country. I'll just read a little bit of what he says. And he describes them in the third person. And they are the two Irish earls and their entourage. They moved on to Basel, a fine, strong, ancient, remarkable city, which is built on that river, the Rhine. There is a very good bridge in the very center of the city over the river, and numerous boats afford a means of leaving it and getting to it from Flanders and the country around the river. Those who occupy and inhabit it are heretics. That's the sentence you liked earlier, Denis. There's a very large church in the center of the city, which of course is still there, in which there are statues and pictures of Luther and Calvin and many other bad, devilish authors. So Tig was on the money there as regards who was Catholic and who wasn't. A very Irish description, but also he sort of nails the landmarks of Basel in that.
Yeah. Well, talking of bad, devilish authors, that leads us on to another chapter in the book, which gives a fantastic description of the arrival of Lord Byron and the poet Shelley and Mary Shelley in Switzerland, in Geneva. And on a clear day, if I had a pair of binoculars from my apartment on the 8th floor here in Petit Saguenay, I would be able to actually see the Villa Diodati on the other side of the lake.
Mm-hmm. Well, Byron stayed in the Villa Diodati because he had a good deal more money than poor old Shelley and his wife, who were sort of on the run. They were staying in the Hotel d'Angleterre for the first couple of days or so, and then they crossed the river by boat and stayed in the Maison Chapuis, which is just below the Villa Diodati. It's no longer there, but it was there up until the late 19th century, I think. What we forget is that the Napoleonic Wars had occurred in the years before that, and so that whole exodus of British tourists or Northern European tourists heading south to Italy had been stopped for a couple of years. So that I think that was one of the reasons why Byron was skedaddling down south with the intention of going to warmer climates in Rome. And the other, of course, that he was escaping, like so many English people heading to Switzerland, he was escaping scandal in England, where various rumors had been circulating about his relationship with his half-sister, and his marriage had fallen apart, and he himself was becoming mad, bad, and dangerous to know. So he was quite happy to trundle down the Rhine. He had an enormous coach that was an imitation of Napoleon's coach, and if you follow his journey down the Rhine into Switzerland, we know he stopped somewhere around Strasbourg or Colmar or there, and I think bedded down one of the housemates in the hotel, and then pitched up at the Hotel des Trois Rois, which is was the big hotel and is the big hotel in Basel. And his coach had a little mini bar, it had a library, and he traveled with a number of animals, and again, in lordly style, and came over the Jura and headed down to Geneva.
So what happened when they all got together in that big villa on the shores of Lake Geneva?
Well, it was a really bad summer, and so a mountain in Indonesia had a volcano had erupted the previous year, and so it was a really dark summer. It was rainy, and they sat around the fire, and they didn't have Zoom or Snapchat or Facebook, so they had no way of communicating with the outside world, and so they had charades, and I think there might have been a little bit of laudanum that Polidori, being a doctor, of course, had scored in Geneva and brought out to the villa. And they egged each other on to devise Gothic stories or horror stories. And Polidori devised a story, not quite then, but he actually stole the germ of the idea from Byron for a vampire story, which eventually became Bram Stoker's Dracula. And Mary Shelley probably had the most success of the four of them. Percy Bysshe Shelley herself, Byron, and Polidori, and she wrote Frankenstein. She wrote Frankenstein down between bouts of babysitting down in the Maison Chapuis on the lake shore that summer, and so that was a good writing summer for her. The lads went off in a boat around the lake from stop to stop, and Byron wrote The Prisoner of Chillon, and she wrote Frankenstein, or at least the first draft of Frankenstein.
Frankenstein himself was a Genevois.
He was a Genevois who had gone to Germany to study, and Geneva at the time was a walled city, and she had some knowledge of the city, but there's a famous scene that's set on the Plain Palais, which at the time was open ground outside of Geneva and rather wild, and the monster attacks the young brother of Frankenstein there and kills him, and so there's a kind of it's a scene of murder. And then there's another famous scene up on the Mer de Glace above Chamonix. So there are a number of settings, and then the final scene is I rather like. It's the murder of Dr. Frankenstein's new wife on his honeymoon. It's totally Love Island melodrama, and the monster arrives by boat crossing Lake Geneva. There's a storm, of course, and there's lightning, and manages to strangle her. Full of gloom and doom, that story.
Yeah. Byron himself, he seems to have been fascinated by the landscape of Switzerland, no? I mean, he had a great phrase, 1,000 years of snow. And sadly, in this day of climate age, that 1,000 years is dwindling rapidly.
Yeah, and if you go around the various glaciers that they describe, there are not many of them less. And like the rest of us, Dennis, they're living in reduced circumstances. And so he did have an eye for the Swiss landscape, but he had a romantic eye for it. And to some extent, he created that idea that scenery could be looked at, because before Byron and before the Romantics, people didn't necessarily think of the Swiss landscape, the Swiss mountains, as pretty or picturesque. It was a kind of an invented category.
I think Shelley himself remarked immediately on the difference, the perceptible difference between France and Switzerland once you cross that border. Something I think people still remark on to this day.
Yes, that it's tidier and that more kept and trimmed and more laundered and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's remarkable that reputation goes back so far.
Yeah, it probably comes from there not being that much land to cultivate, and so if you're going to cultivate it, you may as well make it neat and tidy. I don't know, or perhaps it's an offshoot from Calvinism, the tidy life.
Is there a piece you'd like to read from the book, capturing that sense of Geneva?
I will. I'll read just the opening page, which looks at Geneva as a kind of a neat town on a Sunday, and this is the way the book starts. Sorry, wrong place. Where's Geneva? There we go.
Page 13, I think.
Was it 13?
Run out of town.
Thank you, Dennis.
You're very welcome.
The volume gets turned down on a winter Sunday in Switzerland. You'll find one shop open at the train station, and I imagine that's still the case now.
No, the Migros is open 24 hours now.
Okay, good. In the small towns, you might hear the slither of onion skin Bible pages and a clutch of dark teenagers around a kebab outlet. On the approach to Geneva, speed cameras are out to get you, and the high-rises suggest little room. On the lake, the fog, nature's very own anesthetic, muffles the ducks. They know today is Sunday and are on their best behavior. You could quietly top yourself and nobody would pay much attention. Nature in Geneva seems to flow southwest into France, the Rhone, the Jura, the Savoy Alps, the long drooping crescent of the lake, all head in that direction. They tumble over themselves to escape like weekenders at the border. The wind off the water, the bees, blows them westward. Geneva's writers look to Paris. When Calvin's city got too much for them, there was always the city of light. The playgrounds there were in full swing. And of course, the playgrounds now are not in full swing anywhere. They're all
indeed.
Tied up like they were in my childhood in Northern Ireland, where the playgrounds were locked on a Sunday.
So, Padraig, let's move to the other end of Switzerland. You have a great chapter on Davos, well known to us all. It's become an iconic place in world capitalism, and a place where, according to your book, it had in its day a great reputation as a place of retreat for people suffering from tuberculosis. Yeah,
the tuberculosis, of course, in the 19th century and some way into the 20th century was the scourge of the world, and in particular of damp climates and in Northern Europe. So Switzerland was a place where fairly wealthy people or well-to-do people would go for treatment. And so a whole range of spa towns in the mountains catered to that. And you can still see those hotels and spa parks and water cures, all of which derive from a kind of 19th century health consciousness. So Davos was one of those, and I'll just read how Davos got its start. It was very much to do with the quality of the air, and eventually that's what attracted A.J. Symonds and Robert Louis Stevenson and the man who wrote Conan Doyle and Thomas Mann were the main figures in Davos who wrote about it at some length. Davos owes its origin as a spa town to the district physician, Dr. Spengler. He noticed that returning emigrants with pulmonary complaints quickly recovered in the mountain air. In the Deutsche Klinik for 1862, he published his findings. Soon patients came from all over Europe as tuberculosis racked and coughed its way through 19th century lungs. Treatments included cold morning showers, fresh milk, long spells of lying on deck chairs, breathing clean mountain air, and spitting into their blue Henrys, or Blauer Heinrich, a cobalt blue glass sputum bottle. Which, if you Google blue Henrys, you find all these weird sites that are selling them as mementos of the tuberculosis epidemic. Wow. They're kind of collector's items. These little spittoons, they had a kind of decorative function. Some of them were glass, some of them had silver lids and were initialed by their owners, etc., etc. Basically, a kind of spitting bottle. So Stevenson.
How much time did Thomas Mann actually spend in Davos?
He spent, I think, just a week, because he was based in Munich. The Mann family are from Munich, and I was there in front of their house just about 4 weeks ago, I think, during the Fastnacht break here. And I had booked myself in, as they say, to the Monacensia Library, which is where the Mann family archives are: Thomas Mann, Klaus Mann, and Erika Mann, and Heinrich Mann. And I was looking at documents from the 1920s, but it was just at the start of the coronavirus outbreak, so it was really eerie to be wandering around Munich and crossing the English-Garten just as the continent was waking up to the enormity of the situation we're in. But I spent 3 days there with my white gloves and looking at documents from the 1920s and 1930s. He only spent a week there because his wife had tuberculosis, and he visited her. And I think that started the germ for his novel, The Magic Mountain, which took him quite a while to write. He worked on it. He thought of it very much as a novel that explored that break in Europe between the 19th century, which lived right on until 1918, and then the 20th century, which properly got going about the end of the war, 1918, 1919. So The Magic Mountain came out in the mid-20s sometime, I think.
Is there a piece from that chapter you'd like to read for us?
Thomas Mann on page 63, I think. Mann was conversant with the health crazes, fitness regimes, and rest cures of his day, many of which anticipate the expensive therapeutic culture of present-day Switzerland. The Magic Mountain could be read as a Bible of the spa class, where healing, money, splurge, and purge meet. Spa people are not great readers, however. The rich like to render their illnesses as exclusive, and Davos found ways of catering to them over the years. First the tubercular Russians, then the Germans, now the Russians again. Castorp, who's the main character of The Magic Mountain, breathes his first lungful of Davos air. It lacked odor, content, moisture. It went easily into the lungs and said nothing to the soul. Installed in a room where an American has died 2 days before, he marvels at the humor of corpses ferried down by bobsleigh from the sanatorium higher up the mountain. Davos was very much a Russian colony for a while, and during the Second World War, there was also a group of pro-German Nazis there. But I like this idea that in wintertime, the patients who died in the sanatoria had to be ferried down to the graveyard by bobsleigh. I think if you're going to go, that's a way to go. Do you agree, Dennis?
I do. It sounds fantastic. I'm not a great skier myself, but a bobsleigh I could do.
Yeah, it would be speedy, and it would have its own excitement. So One of my favorite anecdotes in the book is to do with the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, who was the last person to be ferried down to his final resting place. So I'll just read that little
Great. Yeah, let's hear it.
paragraph. Among the last corpses bobsled to the cemetery was that of Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, one of the 3 assassins of Rasputin. Carried out of room 309, exited by the back door of the sanatorium, he was ferried by sled down to his final resting place in the forest cemetery in March 1942. The assassin was first cousin to Prince Philip. The Grand Duke's son, Prince Romanovsky Ilinsky, became mayor of Palm Beach, Florida. Russian royalists have made overtures and offered him the position of Tsar, but he's staying put in the Sunshine State. I'm not quite sure if he's still there today.
So, apart from Switzerland's reputation as a place, a sanatorium for people suffering from tuberculosis, I think also through 20th century literature, we get a sense of Switzerland as a place of intrigue and a place where spies like to congregate. And you reference a couple of those authors like Ian Fleming and Jean Le Carré.
Yeah, Ian Fleming actually has a degree from Geneva University, and John Le Carré, I'm trying to think if he does have a degree from Bern University, but he did study at Bern University and was recruited as a spy there.
When he was 17 years old, is that true?
Sorry?
When he was just 17, according to...
He was just 17. He had run away from school and was recruited, I think, just outside the English church in Elfenau, the diplomatic area of town. And he's still a habitué of Bern. He has a house up in Wengen, and he's through Bern, maybe not these days, but quite often. And the city and the atmosphere of those wonderful luxury Swiss hotels keeps cropping up in his work. He keeps peopling them with Russian mafia types and British skullduggery and Tory arms dealers, and he has a wonderful cast of adult ragamuffins who do business in the rich hotels in Switzerland. So I do like Le Carré's work for that reason. But I guess we should talk about Joyce, Dennis.
Well, we should, but we've actually just received question from Claire O'D.
Hey, Claire.
Packed with information and rich research. It looks like years of work. Would Padraig like to explain a little about the writing process of the Gilded Chalet?
You were saying earlier, Dennis, that the chapters are kind of standalone. So I did tend to work on it chapter by chapter and then knit them together later. I started doing a lot of research in the Swiss Literary Archives in Bern, where Patricia Highsmith's papers are. And then I moved to Basel for some papers, and the Durham Center, and I just got in my car quite a lot and interspersed references to the Swiss landscape and various museums and writers' houses with some online research and a lot of reading. I mean, you can see behind, I'm a reader, an unashamed reader. I won't go on my rant. But I'm constantly amazed at the number of people who don't read anymore, at their limited reading curiosity, and so I think a lot of the research comes from that.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question, I hope, for Claire?
Yeah. But, I suppose it was a break for you from writing poetry and short stories, etc. Did you feel you needed a break from that?
Well, poetry doesn't pay the bills, and nor does prose. So you got to get up for something in the morning. And I got the research bug. There's a bug you feel when you're deep in a book. I'm deep in a book at the moment, and I'm researching in 3 languages for it. And I just love the kind of pizzazz that comes through with with finding, working like a sleuth, working a little bit like one of John le Carré's spies, and trying to find out things and make connections. When I was in Monosenia, I was reading these German diaries by an opera singer who had sung for Hitler in 1933 in Beirut at the Wagner Festival there, and I was kind of skim reading year after year for these things. They were in German and they were written in tiny pencil, and looking forward to getting to 1933 when she met Hitler and he made somewhat of a star of her for the festival that year. But the 1933 diary wasn't there. She pulled it. So she had every other year and years following that, but there was no diary for 1933. So it was a kind of significant piece of censorship on her part. So that was a real find. I do enjoy that aspect of research.
What in fact are you researching at the moment?
I'm looking at a Swiss writer called Annemarie Schwarzenbach and writing her biography. She was a writer and a figure of the 1920s and the 1930s. She died at age 34 in 1942. She was a writer and a lesbian and a morphine addict, and very much hung around with the bright young things in Berlin in the 30s, and interesting character.
A very general question has just come in, Padraig, from Mary Noonan. She's asking, why do you think Switzerland was such a magnet for writers? Is this still the case?
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier. All the usual handful of reasons, I think. You have to go through Switzerland to get somewhere else, and so it was a gateway to the south. Illness was also a reason. Language, perhaps. It has two of the major European languages. It's fairly quiet, so if you want to get something done, if you've got a project, that is a place to go to. I mean, it doesn't have a reputation as a place where you can pick up work, even though you and I do work here, Dennis. But life, the atmosphere in Switzerland is toned down a little bit from the frenzy around us, and so maybe that facilitates writing. But historically, probably war, illness, escape.
Before we come back to the book, we have another question here asking, is there any writer that you ended up loving more at the end of your research than you did at the beginning?
I disliked Patricia Highsmith as a person, but I really liked 2 or 3 of her novels. A lot of her later work is kind of filler work. You can tell that she's kind of going through the motions. But the first 2, I would say, Ripley books, and in particular her, I've forgotten the title of it, her lesbian book, her first lesbian book about Carol. It was made into a movie quite recently. I really like those. I think she's an underestimated talent.
She wrote a number of scripts for movies, no?
She did. She earned quite a lot of money from her movie work, and she was famously mean with her money, and so she gave all her papers to burn, but she gave the rights to her work, and therefore the enormous sums of money she made from television and from film went to Yaddo, the writers' retreat in New York State. I think it's in New York State or Connecticut, somewhere up there.
She was a favorite of Hitchcock, I think, no?
She was, yeah. And Hitchcock made a movie of her work quite early on, in the early 50s, I think. Strangers on a Train, I think.
Yeah. So, Padraig, talking about impecunious writers and how difficult it is to make a living, I guess the patron saint of poverty among writers must be your compatriot, our compatriot, James Joyce, who has had a long and distinguished career with Switzerland.
a long and distinguished and impoverished career, although somebody once tallied up all the money he got from his French admirer who kept giving him checks, and it amounts to quite a lot. I think he was impoverished, but he was also spendthrift, which is not a great combination when you think of it. He pitched up with Nora Barnacle here quite early on. What, with 1904 was it?
Yes, I believe so.
Thereabouts, and they had eloped, and Joyce thought he had a job at the Berlitz School in Zurich, and it turned out that he didn't. He either imagined it or got it wrong. And so he pitched up here with Nora, and I think that little hotel, what was it called? The Gasthaus Hoffnung behind Zurich train station, where they consummated their.
I think the opening passage of that chapter, keeping the wars at arm's length.
Yeah.
Evocative. Would you like to read?
I read the opening bit of that.
Yeah, first passage, the first 4 paragraphs there.
Oh, okay.
That's the same.
When James Joyce and Nora Barnacle first arrived in Zurich on the morning of 11th of October 1904, they were living on borrowed funds. Joyce was wearing another man's boots. Literally, he had borrowed the boots. Eloping from Ireland via Paris, they took a room at the Gasthaus Hoffnung at 16 Reitergasse in Zurich. This was where the young lovers consummated their union. Hoffnung, meaning hope, often proved elusive during the decades ahead, but they were to stick by each other through poverty, 2 world wars, family crisis, and literary fame. They were to find themselves back in Zurich again and again, always by the skin of their teeth. The proprietor of the guest house behind the station was called Dublin, a name the superstitious Joyce appreciated. Under the impression that job was waiting for him at the Berlitz School, Joyce next morning discovered to his dismay that there was no such thing. The director did his best to find the penniless Irish graduate a teaching position in Switzerland, but without success. Writing to his brother Stanislaus, Joyce emphasized shortage of funds and the secrecy surrounding his elopement. Go about the highways of the city, but not to any of my touched friends, and make up £1 before Saturday, which send me on that day without fail, he wrote. The 22-year-old couldn't resist a laddish boast. Finalement, elle n'est pas encore vierge, elle est touchée. And you being in Geneva, Denis, I will leave your listeners to translate that wonderful piece of French into English. The lovers spent a week in Zurich, kicking their heels. Eventually, a vacancy turned up in Trieste on the Adriatic. They were off again. That vacancy, too, proved as elusive as the Swiss one, and they continued down the coast to Pola. It was to be a vagabond life.
Well, he was not so long before he was back in Zurich, Padraig.
He was back at the beginning of the First World War, and because of that war, because they were living in what then would have been the
Austro-Hungarian Empire.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire, and as somebody holding a British passport, and his wife probably holding a British passport as well, they needed to get out fairly quickly, otherwise they would have been interned. So they pitched up in Zurich at the beginning of that war, as they did at the beginning of the Second World War. So Joyce associated Zurich with safety and security, just to answer Mary's question of earlier, that it was a place of refuge, a place to go to. And of course, Switzerland has a long tradition of that. So he spent most of the First World War in Zurich writing Ulysses, and his eye trouble became exacerbated at that time, and he took a trip down to Locarno after an eye operation, and took to Swiss white wine, and really liked that wartime atmosphere you had in Zurich, where it was a refugee town full of people escaping the war.
Yeah, a wonderful passage, Padraig, in that chapter, describing Joyce's declining eyesight, and at the same time correlating that with his reliance on his on his ears, you know, his ability to pick up sounds
and his use of languages and his multilingualism,
which of course fed into Finnegan's Wake. But let's stick with Ulysses.
It did, yeah. No, he had a wonderful grasp of languages, and I'm an international school teacher, and we tend to think of international schools as the full flower of languages. But Joyce had an education where he had Latin and Greek and was able to read Danish and Norwegian, and had picked up German and French and a whole range of languages. So I'll just read that a little bit. It's on page 112, Dennis, is that it?
That's correct, yeah.
Contact with other languages in the smithy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire had made Joyce intensely aware of his own, its registers, dialects, history, and slang. His code shifted from Triestine Italian to Zurich German to modern Greek. Ulysses has the cosmopolitan soundscape of the war years, its language a mixing board, its constituent parts broken down like notes, like an opera. On any given day in Zurich, you never know what languages you might encounter. Joyce became an auditor of the world's sounds, at sea in the flotsam of language, adrift from meaning, aware of multiple levels and the interpenetration of words. A tram bell, a cry in the street, the murmur along a bar, rotting in the next room, vision reduced, his ears took up the slack.
Wonderful, great piece of writing, Padraig. So, how much did Zurich influence the actual plot or storyline of Ulysses, or did it influence it at all?
Well, his main character in Ulysses is a Jewish exile, or somebody of Jewish extraction, originally from Cork, and wandering around. And so that wandering aspect that you get in a town like Zurich, and then in the Circe episode, he draws very much on that visit I mentioned to Locarno, where he went to the Brissago Islands and met, what was her name? It will come to me, it will come to me. The Baroness Saint-Léger. And so he turned her into a kind of siren figure. But there were other women. Joyce had a rather, even though he suffered from glaucoma, he had a rather wandering eye, or a couple of wandering eyes perhaps. And he noticed that across the street there was a lady that he spied in her bathroom or in her toilet perhaps. I think he only ever saw her wrist and the toilet chain, and her name was Martha Fleischmann, and he turned her into a kind of figure in the Wandering Rocks section, I think. So
Gertie McDowell.
Sorry?
Gertie McDowell.
And Gertie McDowell as well is derived from a Swiss figure or a lady that he was writing to, or he had a yen for. But it's very oblique, and if you didn't know the connections, you wouldn't necessarily pick them up in reading the book. Gertie McDowell's based on Dr. Gertrude Kempfer, who was a 26-year-old recovering from tuberculosis down in Locarno. Don't think she was too much interested in Jimmy Joyce personally.
No.
Martha Fleischmann was a little bit more interested. Will I read a little bit about his visit to the Brissago Islands?
Please do.
This is describing the Baroness Saint-Léger, who owned those two islands that are still there on just outside of Ascona, and you can visit them, and her gardens are still there. A siren in winter, perhaps. The Baroness is one of those fascinating figures on the margins of writers' lives. She was born in St. Petersburg in 1856 and was rumored to be the illegitimate daughter of Tsar Alexander II. Her birth certificate gives her parents' names as Nicholas Alexander and Miriam Meyer. Antoinetta was pretty and vivacious. Her piano teacher had been Franz Liszt. 2 husbands quickly palled. Her 3rd husband was the Anglo-Irish Lord Richard Fleming Saint-Léger from Kingstown, present-day Dunleary, apparently descended from Richard the Lionheart. They bought the 2 Brissago Islands for 10,000 Swiss francs, and the Baroness proceeded to import thousands of plants and turn the hideaway into a botanical paradise befitting the Mediterranean microclimate. Her other passion, like Circe's, was for young men. Husband number 3 soon abandoned her in 1897. By the time Joyce pitched up in 1919, she was 63 and as flighty as ever, coming over the water to greet him, standing up in her boat. The poet Rilke, fond of people's castles as he was, had visited the Baroness the same year, so she had no shortage of scribbling admirers. She liked to make puppets and had hundreds of them on the island, which may indicate her psychological makeup.
Very good. So to conclude on Joyce, Padraig, you touch on the last public sighting of Joyce was a month before he died here in Geneva, where he spent a few hours with Sean Lester, who was then the acting Secretary General of the League of Nations. I always find it a poignant detail that he chose to stay in the Richmond Hotel because, of course, the longest place the Joyce family ever lived in Dublin was North Richmond Street. I think Joyce was quite superstitious about having keepsakes of Dublin about him at all times.
And you mentioned earlier some connection with GLAS itself, the foundation of the...
Yeah, well, actually, yes, now that you mention it, when we contacted David Norris and asked him to put on his one-man show, Do You Hear What I See? He specifically asked if we could accommodate him in the Richmond Hotel. I phoned the Richmond Hotel, explained what we were doing, and they'd never heard of the Joycean connection, but they agreed to give Senator Norris free bed. We had to pay for the breakfast, which was quite expensive, I can tell you. But he awakened us to a connection between Joyce and Geneva that at least I was not aware of until he told me. And that was quite sad, I think. Joyce coming out of Nazi-occupied France with his grandson.
It was very much a last-ditch exodus, really.
And Finnegan's Wake had been published to absolutely no interest whatsoever.
Yeah, it felt like a duck in the water. Yeah, we're looking at 1940, December 1940, and of course Europe was at war again, and Joyce was pretty much blind by then and needed to be led about, but he was a celebrated writer. And so I just read that little passage, Dennis, where he's holed up in the Richmond Hotel, blind and listening to Radio Erin. In December 1940, they came into Switzerland by way of Geneva, where Stephen Joyce, the writer's 8-year-old grandson, had his bicycle impounded at the border because of inability to pay import duties. I think that's a quintessentially Swiss detail.
Yeah, you're just not to pick it up.
Yeah, war or no war, import duties need to be imposed. They spent the night of the 14th of December at the Richmond Hotel before moving on to Lausanne. Sean Lester, acting Secretary General of the League of Nations and a Belfast man, had tea with the Joyce family on the Sunday afternoon in the marble and ormolu salon of their hotel, and it still is. I've been in it, you've been in it too, Dennis. It's still marble and ormolu. The famous Joyce is tall, slight, in the 50s, blue eyes and a good thatch of hair. No one would hesitate in looking at him to recognize his nationality and his accent of Dublin as when he left it over 30 years ago. His eyesight is very bad, and he told me it had been saved some years ago for him by the famous Voigt of Zurich, who had also operated on the Irish President De Valera's eyes. His son, seemingly in his late 20s, came in first, a fine, well-built fellow with a peculiar hybrid accent in English. He told me he is a singer and has sung in Paris and New York. The Richmond sits one block back from the more illustrious Hotel Beau Rivage on Geneva's lakeshore. The Beau Rivage is where royalty stayed, where Empress Sisi of Austria-Hungary died from a madman's stiletto, where Somerset Maugham and other international spies kept their ears open. The Richmond is equally glitzy. Charlie Chaplin, Sophia Loren, and Michael Jackson found rooms there with a view. It's a historic corner overlooking Brunswick Monument, a history not lost on James Joyce. As a boy, he had lived on Dublin's North Richmond Street. Great Brunswick Street was where he sang in the ancient concert rooms at the beginning of the century. The Joyce family might have felt they were once again at history's mercy.
Very good.
And they were. He died shortly after that and is buried in Flintern Cemetery in Zurich.
Indeed.
And let's hope he stays there.
You're not for digging him up.
I'm not for digging him up. I'm totally against this kind of faux sentimental nationalism that we have to dig him up and send him back. Leave him alone.
Okay. But one detail from that conversation, which always stays with me, is when Lester asks Joy's family if they are Mrs. Joyce, if she ever thought of going back home to Ireland,
Mm-hmm.
Joyce replied that he was attached to it daily and nightly, and the only reason, according to Mrs. Joyce, that they didn't go home was that it might be somewhat embarrassing circumstance, given his chosen path of exile. Rather unfortunate that he didn't come home, no?
Yeah, well, you had a choice between two neutral countries. Ireland was ostensibly neutral at the time, and Switzerland was too. And two roads diverge in a wood, and I chose the less travelled one. That has made all the difference, and he did.
Padraig, I have another, well, it's not a question, it's a comment from Glenn O'Neill on the first paragraph of the Gilded Chalet. I loved that you said you learned in Switzerland to cross my sevens and cut the butter straight. I did, he says. And then there's a question from Anne Kokiakivi, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Might you talk a little bit about Wordsworth in Switzerland? I can't recall if Wordsworth features in the book at all, does it?
That'll be in the follow-up, Anne.
Very good.
But on the butter thing, I do remember when I was here in 17, I was staying with a family, and breakfast, before going to work, breakfast every morning, and the mother of the house actually telling me point blank, in Switzerland we cut the butter straight, and she showed me how to do it. Parallel to the edge of the butter pat, not at an angle as you might do.
And the same with the cheese.
And the same with the cheese, yeah.
Question here from Ray Toa, which is a bit off topic. Does Patrick Kavanagh warrant all the praise and homage that he's received in recent years as a fellow Monaghan man?
I think all poets merit praise because they're such overlooked creatures, really. I mean, nobody pays them any money. Most of them get forgotten about. And so if you can corner any little piece of the market at all, as Kavanagh did, go for it.
Right. Padraig, one last question for you. I mean, writers have played a great role in shaping our image, the image that we hold of Switzerland, our perception of the place, especially for people who've never visited Switzerland. Well, I was just wondering, what do we know of Swiss writers today? I mean, apart from Rousseau, I can't think of any household names, at least none that come to mind immediately.
The two that people mostly know are Dürrenmatt and Max Frisch, and they mostly knew them when I was growing up, and so I'm not quite sure if their reputation in Switzerland is high, and I'm not quite sure if outside of German studies programs they're still that well known. Both of them were dramatists, so they're probably known on the stage. And then the Swiss writer who's probably best known now that he's still alive is Peter Stamm, because again, it's a question of translation. So Peter Stamm writes these very sharply etched, well observed, rather dry novels set in Switzerland, but they could be set anywhere. He doesn't necessarily see. I did an interview with him a couple of years ago, and I remember putting that question to him, how he saw himself as a writer, and he doesn't necessarily see himself as a Swiss first and a writer second. He has a Swiss train pass, and he likes to write on the trains. He likes to head off and just wander around the country on trains and write. That's a way to go, Dennis.
He gets great value from his abonnement.
He does indeed. Probably not these days, though, but he's probably, like the rest of us, confined to house.
Perhaps we'll conclude with a passage from the book. It's actually from the first chapter on Run Out of Town, about Rousseau, the great Swiss writer. And a man who comes from...
What page is it on, Dennis?
Page 13.
Okay.
You actually read a little bit of it earlier from that.
Yeah, I'll read the two following paragraphs then, but
yeah,
Geneva.
Rousseau is Geneva's very own bigwig.
Okay. Rousseau is Geneva's very own bigwig. He was born here into a world of clocks and gets ticked off when you ask people to name a Swiss writer. More often than not, they say Heidi or the Swiss Family Robinson and can't name the authors. But the well-read mention Rousseau. He was a polymath. When he turned his pen towards a subject, justice, romance, education, autobiography, nature, he changed it. His buzzing ideas got up Calvinist Geneva's nose, and so he was often on the road, in a huff, mostly across the border in France. He handed down this role, the writer challenging orthodoxy, to his Swiss successors. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. That's Rousseau. We all need to rattle our chains.
Well said. Thank you so much, Padraig. It's been a great hour to spend with you, and I highly recommend again the Gilded Chalet. Great read. And you can find out more about Padraig and his work on his excellent website, padraigrooney.com. I believe that's right, Padraig, man?
Yeah.
Yeah. And our great thanks tonight to Owen O'Sullivan, who's been responsible for technical support to this online event. And we'll review how it's gone, and we'll see if we can do another one in the next week or two. So thank you all, and a very good night from us here in Geneva and Padraig and Basel.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.